Welcome to the lecture 12 of the lecture series, Psychology of Well-Being. Well, today we are going to engage with one pertinent topic, that is how to enhance subjective well-being of employees working in various organizations by taking care of stress management techniques. Before this particular lecture, in lecture 10 and 11, we had seen that well-being or subjective well-being can be enhanced with the help of some positive experiences and enhancing those positive experiences like gratitude, empathy, etc. But one of the important ways to enhance subjective well-being, particularly in the context of modern life where there can be variety of stressors around people, particularly in the organizational setting, it becomes important that we pay some attention to the subjective well-being of the employees. And in this lecture, we are going to focus on the individual level interventions. In the next lecture, which is lecture 13, we will focus on the organizational level interventions in terms of stress management techniques to enhance subjective well-being of the employees. So what are the various aspects of stress management technique for the employees that we are going to go into? Well, we are going to begin with the basic understanding of fostering or enhancing subjective well-being among the employees. So we'll be looking again into, or rather we will be recapitulating the understanding of subjective well-being and what and how it might make sense in the context of organizational life of people, or rather I should say the employees. We'll then look into the basic conceptual framework of stress, coping, and well-being. What is the interrelationship amongst these processes? And then we'll be looking at how to enhance the capabilities of the employees to manage their stress or cope better with the stress. And the focus again would be on individual level as well as organizational level interventions. And we will also learn about the primary, secondary, and tertiary interventions depending upon when we are intervening as far as the onset of stress is concerned. Well, we'll be going into the details of stress management interventions or techniques at the individual level. And then finally, we'll take a look at the efficacy of stress management interventions or SMI at the individual level. So let's take a brief look again at the concept of subjective well-being. And we have already seen that it is the subjective evaluation of one's own life in terms of having positive emotions, having low negative emotions, and having higher satisfaction in life. And we have also seen that both internal and external factors may be associated with that. Internal like physical health, personality traits, and external like work life, access to material resources, etc. We've also seen the limitations that uh, in adverse circumstances, it might not tell us much about how to build a more just society. It just focuses on how the external factors in terms of good society may lead to subjective well-being. However, we will still look at the strengths of this particular concept and try and see that how positive emotions can be enhanced or life satisfaction can be enhanced amongst the employees by intervening at the level of managing stress amongst people. We've also seen that these are hedonic view of this particular kind of well-being that we have conceptualized. It's based on the hedonic view of well-being that takes into account happiness or pleasure of the person. Okay, so from there on, let's move on to the understanding of stress, coping, and well-being, how these are interrelated. What rationale do we have to study stress or stress management or coping with the stress in order to take care of or enhance the well-being of the employees? And here goes the interrelationship. We find that there can be plenty of stressors, a variety of stressors in one's life, related to work, related to personal life, related to one's own achievement, related to one's own work, everyday work, or long-term plans that a person may be having. And it actually becomes a stressor because of the appraisal. So a potential stressor is appraised in a direction, in a manner that it may actually lead to high, low, or very low level of stress, or maybe no stress at all. Now, if there is moderate or high level of stress that the person experiences, then comes the coping mechanism of people. How do we cope with the stress? How do we address the stress? And we may find that if the stress is coped in an effective manner, then it may lead to well-being of the person. If it is not uh, addressed or coped with in an effective manner, then it may lead to a lower sense of well-being or subjective well-being amongst the people or amongst the employees. Now, let us look at the various types of stress management interventions that could be possible. And we can see here that the stress management interventions are conceptualized again on the basis of the interrelationship of stressor, appraisal, stress, coping, and well-being. We find that, let's begin with the first kind of intervention that's given alongside stressor. There are possibilities when we try to minimize the stressor in the environment, and this is known as primary intervention. We will look into it in the context of employees, that how we can try and minimize the stressors or the causes of stress to the minimum. For example, we'll be looking into how a selection of people, of the employees, can be done in a manner that they may be more resilient, or in other words, or in some other ways, if we look at minimizing stressors in the environment, we may also look at certain kinds of initiatives that can be taken to make the environment, the work environment itself, the organizational environment itself, conducive rather than problematic or stressful for the employees. So that's one simple understanding of primary intervention. And that happens at the level of minimizing the level of stressors. Then we move on to appraisal, and at the level of appraisal, we find that stress management involves secondary intervention, that is early detection and treatment. Now, how does it happen? It happens on the basis of when the stress is felt by the person and one needs help for that stressful life condition, then its early detection and early treatment is recommended, and the intervention can happen at the level of reappraisal of the stressor itself. So the appraisal itself can actually be modified or refined or further um, changed positively, so that early treatment after the early detection of stressful life condition or stressful experience can actually take place. Then there is another way to look at the intervention that is known as response focused intervention, which is given alongside stress or the stressful experience. And we tend to we tend to address the response of the person in terms of the experience of stress. And that is done, for example, by making the person more relaxed with the help of relaxation techniques or meditation techniques or other kinds of therapies that we'll be looking into very shortly. And then finally, we also find that there is another kind of intervention or stress management technique that is known as tertiary intervention that's given as a second point alongside stress. And we find that in tertiary intervention, again, the problem that is particularly the chronic stress that is being experienced or that may be experienced by people, that is addressed with the help of counseling or with the help of some suitable rehabilitation for physical or psychological disability. So that's how we look at the uh, relationship between stressor, stress coping and well-being related theoretical framework and stress management intervention. So we just saw that there can be different kinds of interventions depending upon where and how stress management techniques can be applied, whether it is primary intervention at the level of minimizing the stressor or at the level of appraisal. Um, we try to positively change the appraisal, and that's secondary intervention because we are engaging in early detection and early treatment. And then we can also do the same secondary intervention by focusing on the response or the stress experience itself by applying various kinds of techniques that is response focused. And then finally, also tertiary intervention that addresses the chronic stress conditions. Now, it's also important to understand that, as I mentioned earlier, there can be a variety of ways in which secondary intervention at the level of appraisal or antecedent focused intervention can take place. For example, we find on the right top corner cognitive behavioral therapy that helps us reinterpret the nature of the stressor that happens at the level of appraisal or at antecedent focused intervention. Then if we look at the uh, left bottom corner, we find that there is an example of response focused intervention or response focused intervention that's known as the secondary intervention, or one of the types of secondary intervention rather. And we find that there can be a variety of ways in which it can be attempted. For example, relaxation, meditation, mindfulness techniques. We also notice that these various types of interventions are actually also known as ways of coping, a particular way of coping that is known as emotion regulation. And emotion regulation, again, can happen, as we have seen, in a variety of ways with the help of response focused intervention. That is one of the types of secondary intervention because we tend to detect the problem early and provide the intervention or treatment early. And then there can also be, as we have seen, secondary intervention type, which is appraisal or antecedent focused intervention. And we have taken the example of cognitive behavioral therapy or technique. So this is a comprehensive graphical representation of various types of stress management interventions at the individual level. and its connection with stress coping and well-being theoretical framework, or the framework related to stress coping and well-being interrelationship. So, in other words, finally, I must mention that the stress management interventions, most of it, excluding the primary intervention um, technique, that is to minimize the stressor in the environment, we find that secondary intervention primarily is associated with the coping process. Even tertiary intervention is more about the support or the interventions from others to address chronic stress. So, secondary intervention primarily uh, may be taken as emotion regulation techniques also. With that, let us move on to the organizational settings where how these stress management interventions or SMIs can be applied for the employees at the individual level. And we find that the basic nature of interventions entails reducing anxiety and depression and enhancing positive emotions or well being of the person. Primary intervention involves reducing the sources of stress by taking care of employees' profile in terms of having more resilience towards stressful conditions, and that may also become a part of the selection process. Then, secondary intervention, as we have already seen, it revolves around or it is about early detection and early intervention or treatment, and it can be of two types: antecedent or appraisal focused intervention, as we have seen in the earlier slide, and response focused intervention that also we have already seen. We'll be going into the details of that very soon. Then tertiary intervention, as we have already seen, for the employees, it could be about rehabilitation for people facing chronic stress with the help of counseling or with the help of management of physical or psychological disability. With that, let us move on to first primary and tertiary intervention because of the very rationale that it is the secondary intervention at the individual level that has been more effective than the primary and tertiary intervention, as we will see in the efficacy of those kinds of interventions also, that how these have been quite effective. However, it also becomes important that we also lay some emphasis on the primary and tertiary level interventions at the individual level. So, as far as the primary intervention goes, the focus is on selecting people with skills and attributes to stand the challenges of the job. To avoid people who might not be able to stand the challenges of the job, particularly in the job environment that entails high levels of stress. Well, we have also seen that the reviews of various studies related to primary and tertiary intervention at the individual level in the organizational setting tells us that the primary intervention may not work as far as its practice is concerned, particularly because, I beg your pardon, it may work in theory as a stress management intervention, but only scarcely it is being used or it has been utilized in practice with the aim of managing stress among the employees. So people might be getting selected or might be getting selected on the basis of skills and attributes, but that has not been paid much attention to, as the literature points out, from the point of view of having more resilience for the purpose of handling stress in life that could lead to better sense of well-being. Similarly, we have seen that in tertiary intervention, counseling and rehabilitation for the employees facing excessive chronic stress. Now, this is again something that needs to be further emphasized, although there isn't much evidence that it has been greatly emphasized in a variety of organizations. And the top level management also needs to think in terms of this kind of intervention, that is tertiary intervention, particularly in cases where people may find excessive amounts of stress in their lives, and it becomes important for the organization to take care of such kind of employees. And then we move on to the secondary intervention techniques, and we find that one of these techniques is relaxation technique. And the basic assumption here is that the relaxation can be an antidote to stressful condition. That may also include anger, anxiety, etc. Well, one of the techniques utilized here is the progressive muscle relaxation technique. And it is about inducing tension and then relaxing the muscles of the body in a particular order. For example, one can begin with inducing tension in and then relaxing the muscle of the forehead, and then those of face downwards and other body parts further downwards. Well, it has proved to be effective in reducing stress, this relaxation technique. And then we move on to meditation. This term meditation might also be familiar to many of us, but it's important to understand that it has its own origin in the religio spiritual traditions of the non-Western societies that entails realizing oneness with oneself and other forms of existence by transcending individualistic or individual possession related concerns. And that is typically spiritual or transcendental aspect of one's worldview, and that is utilized in the meditation process, ideally speaking. However, currently it is being packaged as a technique of stress management that is being imported from the Western world, and the focus is on more standardized physical and mental exercises such as focusing on one's breath or chanting that may help reduce intrusive thoughts. Both meditation and relaxation are response-focused techniques rather than appraisal-focused techniques that we have understood as a concept in the previous slide. Why response-focused techniques? Because we have seen that both meditation and relaxation are focusing on the experience of stress itself rather than the appraisal of the stressor. Let us move on to another technique of secondary intervention, and that is cognitive behavioral therapy. And we find that cognitive behavioral therapy is actually an antecedent or appraisal focused technique that tends to change the interpretation of the stressor. Following processes are involved in that. A clearer understanding of the sources of stress. It becomes important that the client or the person facing stressful experiences has a clearer understanding of the sources of stress. By checking whether the appraisal of the stressor is irrational. For example, believing that most of the people are upset with me, when in reality it may not be so. I may not have checked with the majority of people around me that whether they are upset with me or not, but yet I have this thought and related feeling of upset or of emotional disturbance that most of the people are upset with me. So this needs to be checked, whether the such kind of appraisal of stressor, I beg your pardon, is logical or illogical or irrational. Then one also needs to develop healthier appraisal of the potentially stressful situation. And that is where we find that the actual change or positive change in the interpretation of the potentially stressful stimuli actually happens. And that is the crux of cognitive behavioral therapy. Well, if that is fine, then we move on to mindfulness techniques as another very popular technique, and we find that this is another response focused technique because we focus on the stressful experience and how to modulate that, how to change that kind of an experience um, with the help of some of the ways to engage with the stressful experience itself, just like we have seen relaxation technique and the meditation techniques. So rather than neglecting or suppressing the current experiences, one goes through these with acceptance, compassion, and without being judgmental about the current experiences. So the client or the person who is facing stress, himself or herself, learns not to neglect and suppress the current experiences one is going through, but he or she takes these with acceptance, compassion, and without being judgmental about such experiences. This helps the person address negative thoughts and emotions and develop more positive ways of life. So that is mindfulness technique. We also see some multimodal techniques where we can combine mindfulness technique with cognitive behavioral therapy. And we find that that is known as mindfulness based cognitive therapy, that is MBCT. First, we learn to experience mindfulness, which is to accept rather than neglect or suppress current life experiences with compassion and without any kind of judgment. And then the negative thoughts or stresses addressed with the help of some of the basic understanding of cognitive behavioral therapy that we saw earlier, that we try to look at the source of those negative thoughts and try to address them by having more positive ways to understand the life situation. So that is MBCT, or mindfulness based cognitive therapy. Well, very few studies that have been conducted to evaluate its effectiveness have indicated its role in reducing emotional exhaustion. So there are some evidences, and we'll be going into the details of such evidences very soon. For example, as we just saw in case of MBCT, it may help reduce emotional exhaustion. We finally move on to the efficacy of stress management intervention, or SMI, at the individual level, and we find that use of experimental method, and here one term is introduced which is parallel to experimental method, that is known as randomized controlled trial, because we use random assignment of participants in various uh, categories like experimental group and the control group pertaining to the independent variable. And that independent variable is nothing but the intervention technique. Well, that helps assess efficacy of the interventions. The literature by the reviewers also point out that there is a need to apply both quantitative as well as qualitative methods that we saw in lecture 7, 8, and 9. Primarily 8 and 9, because in lecture 9 we saw the quantitative technique, a particular quantitative technique known as the experimental technique or the experimental method. Well, the results have shown relatively greater effect size or relatively greater amount of effect or extent of effect of cognitive behavioral therapy than other techniques such as relaxation, meditation, etc. However, more direct comparisons of techniques are recommended by the reviewers. Why? Because currently a more systematic, currently a systematic understanding or systematic comparison of various techniques are not available. Plus, we have also seen that there can be non-employee setting where these techniques have been utilized. So a more systematic comparison of these techniques in the organizational setting is something that could be is something that is the need of the hour as far as understanding the efficacy of SMI is concerned. Results also have pointed out that multimodal intervention, that is combination of techniques such as CBT and mindfulness, have shown medium effect, not very large effect, but these these effects actually increase over time and have more lasting effect. Also, since the effects of various interventions are varied or heterogeneous, the process of implementation of these techniques also need to be assessed for a better understanding of efficacy of SMI. What does it mean? We find that it is not only the outcome that could be important in terms of whether or not a particular technique works, but the process of implementation, how it is being implemented, a particular technique also has to be studied with the help of variety of methods, including qualitative method. And that is something which tells us meaningfully about the efficacy of various kinds of SMI that we have studied in this particular lecture. In the next lecture, we will be looking into stress management interventions or SMIs for employees at the organizational level. So what kind of interventions that organization or organizational mechanisms can entail as far as managing stress and thereby fostering well-being or subjective well-being of people can actually be attained. Thank you very much.